Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sid Melcher. I'm Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I want to welcome you all to our last instant issues of 2019. I bring the apologies and regrets from our president, John Morse. Unfortunately, he took a spill on Saturday and broke his wrist, so he is unable to be with us. Very telling, his email to me began by apologizing that the entire email was in lowercase. So I want to begin by thanking our Instant Issues series sponsors, Glen Meadow, Greenfield Savings, Sir Speedy, Wilbraham and Munson Academy, and as always, special thanks to NAI Plotkin and 1350 Main Street LLC, who provide us with the space here. The board members present here are Vice President Mary Beth Bergeron, Jeremy Cole, who is videotaping for us. We don't have Ken First here, right? Okay, so I won't bring him up. Gary Lafort, Megan Lungi, and Melika is not here either, and John David Perez. Did I miss anyone? Okay. And special thanks to John and Meg Young, who are, as always, registering people. So thank you to them. On upcoming program, you'll see a goldenrod sheet about our next adventure in international dining, which will be at the Blue Elephant on Boston Road in Wilbraham. Right now we have the date is Tuesday, December 10th. We'll have a social hour from 5 to 5:30. Dinner will start promptly at 5:30. We do not yet have the price or the menu. So that is going to be released by email. So if you're not on my email list and you're interested in going, you need to let me know and give me your email list, your email address. But I'm hoping that within the next week or so we will have that established. Space is limited and these are very popular programs, so I hope everybody who's interested will be able to go, but registration should open in about a week or so. As I said, this is the last program for this year. Right now, we're working on a number of programs in the spring to focus on Ireland, El Salvador, cybersecurity, and African politics. And also watch out for more information soon about our annual Global Trivia Challenge fundraiser in April. Membership. This is a membership form. If you're not a member, join. As Gary Breton used to say, we're a cheap date. In addition to getting access to membership discounts and things like that, you're supporting all of the programs that we do, all of the work we do in the community, including our partnership with the State Department, International Visitor Leadership Program, and our partnership with local schools. So if you are not a member, I hope you will join. If you are a member, the fall renewal letters have just gone out, so please do renew. Our speaker today is Dr. Kavita Khory. She is the Ruth Lawson Professor of Politics and the brand new, as of July 1st, Carol Hoffmann Collins Director of the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives at Mount Holyoke College. We have an extremely long relationship with Mount Holyoke because their president, Mary Woolley, co-founded us in 1926. And so, yay, Mount Holyoke. We've worked with them on many programs. Some of you will remember when Phyllis Oakley came to speak several years ago. And that was a wonderful partnership also with the McCulloch Center. So we're delighted to have you here. Her scholarship and teaching cover the fields of international relations and comparative politics. Informed by a variety of disciplinary perspectives, her work ranges from analyzing political violence in South Asia to tackling questions of political identity and citizenship in multicultural societies. Kavita Khory has written about nationalism and ethnic conflict in Pakistan, insurgency movements, and regional security challenges in South Asia, and the domestic and foreign policy implications for Pakistan of the US war in Afghanistan. Her current research explores transnational political mobilization among South Asian diaspora populations in North America and Europe. locating contemporary forms of migration from South Asia in broader historical and theoretical contexts. Her work focuses on transnational forms of activism and political violence involving diaspora organizations with ties to India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. And it was a Google search involving Sri Lanka that led me to her several months ago. She is especially interested in analyzing both historical antecedents and contemporary debates linking migration with security in the US and countries in the European Union. Kavita Khory is the editor of Global Migration, Challenges in the 21st Century, published in 2012, which is based on the McCulloch Center Conference on Migration in March 2010. She will be speaking with us today on security challenges in South Asia. Please join me in welcoming Kavita Khory.
Thank you so much, Sid. It's such a pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can balance this out of sight. Thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned our long history and relationship with Mount Holyoke. It's really a great pleasure to be talking with you here today about South Asia, and chiefly about the security challenges that face the countries in the region. And the countries in the region, let me just be clear right from the outset, are Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, and more recently, Afghanistan. As you'll notice, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a couple of minutes, the conception of South Asia as a region is slightly fluid. To be perfectly honest, this is so much fun to be here today because South Asia doesn't receive much attention in the US media or among policymakers unless there is a catastrophe or a crisis of some sort or another that directly impacts US foreign policy. In fact, I think sort of going back to sort of the history of South Asia and the way in which South Asia has been addressed in this country, both in terms of policy making and the academy, the heyday, and there's sort of its waxes and wanes, the heyday was at the outset of the Cold War, during a good part of the Cold War, and then during the latter part of the Cold War, the last 10 years, when the United States fought the last battle of the Cold War in Afghanistan, and with the Soviet intervention there from 1979 to 1989. After the end of the Cold War, Pakistan and South Asia more generally dropped off the radar and resurfaced again very prominently in the wake of the attacks of 9/11. Today, the United States continues to fight a war in Afghanistan, and it is the United States' longest serving war today. Okay? I mean, that's a huge thing right there. Yet, as I talk with my students, how much do we really hear or read about Pakistan, Afghanistan, or South Asia for that matter? Just to sort of start us off a little bit over here. The population of South Asia is about 1.9 billion. That is nearly 1/4 of the population of the world, and it makes it the most populous and densely populated region of the world, right there. So it is a region that we should be paying some attention to. Given the vast sort of complexity of the region, the diversity of the region and its population, the security concerns of the people tend to be sort of a complex story. In other words, whose security are we talking about? Are we talking about the security of states, societies, or ordinary people like ourselves? Indeed, if we start thinking about security and security perceptions and threat perceptions, as one might imagine, the picture from Islamabad looks very different from the picture from Colombo, Kathmandu, or New Delhi. In other words, whose security are we thinking about, talking about over here? And that, of course, raises questions about how we address these security concerns and security problems. While I would argue that security problems and challenges are locally specific in terms of particular countries, regions, areas, and are influenced by local politics and cultures, they reflect in many ways the shared regional problems that all of these countries in the region face in one way or another. And I will be talking about these. But these are problems like forced migration, resource scarcity, climate change, armed conflicts, and political violence. Despite the external threats to the region as a whole, but also individual countries, I would argue, again, that the real threat to South Asian states and societies comes from within. In other words, it is the internal challenges and threats that are the most urgent and the most serious in many ways. While there is a growing recognition that both traditional and non-traditional security require regional solutions, there is a lack of consensus on what the problems themselves are and what the solutions might be. More critically, the main obstacles to such cooperation in addressing common and shared problems are mutual suspicion, mistrust, and the tendency on the part of states in the region to view security threats and problems as zero-sum gains, i.e., if one country benefits, the other automatically loses right there. I think the main sort of crux of the argument over here is that the unresolved problems and challenges of South Asia, which are very serious, the main obstacle and the main impediment to those problems and addressing them is the major conflict in the region today, the conflict between India and Pakistan. If you had asked me the question about what are the main impediments to addressing common and shared security in the region, even I think about a year or 2 years ago, I would have said, well, you know what? You can work around the conflict between India and Pakistan. We can figure out ways, and people in the region are doing precisely that, to be able to sort of bracket off the main conflict, but yet come together on other issues. Today, I'm not so sure, and I'll talk more about that in the latter part of my comments over here. So I'm going to sort of, first of all, explain a little bit about what I mean by South Asia as a region and why this is sort of a contested issue in many ways. I'll then talk about the security problems facing South Asia and South Asian countries, and it's going to be a broad overview. And then lastly, I'll sort of address what I see as some of the more positive developments in the region, but also some of the flashpoints and prospects for regional cooperation. So let me just first of all, before I go into what is South Asia, very quickly sort of make a distinction that I will be using throughout this talk between traditional and non-traditional security. Traditional security is about bombs, guns, bullets. It's about state security. It's about territorial integrity and state sovereignty. That's the traditional way in which we think about security, balance of power politics, alliance systems, all of those things. When we think more carefully about non-traditional issues, which I don't think can be easily separated from traditional security concerns, we suddenly find ourselves wrestling with a much broader set of issues. And these include, and I don't think this is by any stretch of the imagination limited to South Asia, given what we're all dealing with, but these include forced migration, refugees, internally displaced persons, environmental pollution. Anyone seen pictures and clips of New Delhi in the last few days? Right there. Climate change, resource scarcity, and political violence. I think it's also important to keep in mind over here as we go through these different security challenges that not only can we not separate them from traditional security challenges, but they also have a tendency of spilling over territorial boundaries. And they also have a tendency of exacerbating existing conflicts. And you'll see, scholars often refer to non-traditional security issues as threat multipliers. In other words, they make existing conflicts and tensions worse. They are not necessarily the roots of existing or sources of tension, but they do make them worse. You'll have to excuse me for 1 minute while I grab this bottle of water. Thank you. Let me see if I can balance this somewhere here, or maybe not. Okay, got a spot for it. Okay, so what exactly is South Asia? From a historian's point of view, and I'm a political scientist, but I do love history. And as I tell my students, you can't learn about political science without first learning about history. So as far as historians go, South Asia is a relatively new concept. It's a concept that comes out of the Cold War in many respects. And it's a concept that we have become more familiar with over the years since the decolonization and the creation of independent countries in South Asia in 1947, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc. Until then, the region was referred to as the Indian subcontinent. And very often, it is still referred to as the Indian subcontinent, and that can be quite problematic, particularly if we're talking about countries in South Asia that are not India. Okay? It is largely a geographic concept and not a political one. I would also alert you that it's very difficult to talk about South Asia today as a bounded region. In other words, if we're going to talk about South Asia, we have to talk about South Asia's neighbors, principally China, but also Russia, Iran. Okay, so the list goes on. And I think it's really important to sort of locate South Asia security politics in this larger sort of, I think, larger idea of what constitutes a region and the fact that these security problems run across national and territorial boundaries. Despite the ties of kinship, culture, and language that run throughout the region, South Asia remains one of the least integrated regions of the world today in terms of trade, travel, cultural exchanges, regional cooperation, norms, and legal frameworks. Unlike almost any other region of the world today, there are no common security structures or alliance systems. And as a political scientist, I've often sort of thought about and written about the idea of the least integrated region of the world. But this is brought home to me in a very sort of immediate way and in a very personal way when I teach courses on South Asia at Mount Holyoke. For example, I teach a seminar on war and peace in South Asia. Nice title there, right? And it attracts a lot of international students. Mount Holyoke has 28% of its student body is international, and a large number of them come from Asia, at least at this point in time. When I look around my South Asian politics, war and peace classroom, I see students from around the world. And a number of them are from South Asia, from India, from Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the list goes on. What is, I think, most striking for me and my students is that this is the first time that many of them have encountered a person from another country in South Asia. Think about that, right there. And this is most striking in the case of Indian and Pakistani students who have only learned about each other in their history books and now through social media, but they have never actually sat down to have a conversation with somebody from another country in the region. And that happens for the first time in a Mount Holyoke classroom. And that is just to give you an example of how much this impacts ordinary people, which we don't really sort of think about over here. So even while the states in South Asia face common problems, competing national interests and bilateral conflicts have prevented them from coming up with common regional solutions. I'll again emphasize that one of the issues that is there, and I think Indians might perhaps disagree with this, is that the region is India-centric. And it's not only about India being the largest country and the most populous country in the region, but it's also the fact that India, at one time or another, has been involved in conflicts with all of its neighbors. Territorial conflicts, conflicts over resources, conflicts over rivers, okay? And that really right there gives you a little bit of the idea of what's going on. I think the current, I think it's very difficult to think about current problems today without pointing out two things. And I would argue that these are sort of the enduring features of South Asia. The first one is outstanding disputes over territorial boundaries, which are the legacies of colonialism and partition, and most of them remain unresolved today. Just to give you some examples. The first one that's been very much in the news is the disputed territory of Kashmir, disputed between India and Pakistan, and China lays claim to a small piece of it as well. The second big one is the disputed boundary, the Durand Line, between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Many of Pakistan's, I think, threat perceptions, and I think Pakistan's own policies in Afghanistan, and I would say deeply flawed policies in Afghanistan, are rooted in precisely this disputed boundary and disputed conflict. Recently, and this is one of the positive things, I think, India and Bangladesh have been able to solve their disputed boundary problem. But nonetheless, these two big ones, and let's not forget India and China's disputed boundary there, these really, in many ways, I think, are part of this very complicated geopolitical structure in the region. So that's the first sort of enduring, I think, feature. The second thing that is enduring and problematic from my perspective is the contested ideas of nation and state building. And these are ideas that remain highly contested and challenged even today throughout the region. These are ongoing debates about nationalism. In other words, who is an Indian? Who is a Pakistani? Who is a Sri Lankan? There are ongoing debates about nationhood and citizenship. If you've been keeping up with the news, India disenfranchised 4 million people in Assam a couple of months ago. And I'll be happy to talk more about that. There are ongoing debates in Pakistan today whether Afghan refugees who have been in the country for nearly 40 years or second, third generation Afghans should be eligible for Pakistani citizenship or a Pakistani passport. So these are sort of the enduring sort of battles that go on about not only the idea of a nation, but also citizenship. Who belongs? What are the principal political identities? And flowing from that, how do we conceive of the state, the government itself, okay? And how do we allocate resources based on those identities, governments and the states themselves? So let's complicate it even more than it already is. South Asia has 3 nuclear powers, right there: India, Pakistan, and China. Today, Pakistan is aiming to be or develop a nuclear arsenal that is about the 3rd or the 4th largest arsenal in the world today. Okay? India is not far behind, and China. So right there, it's not only states that are nuclear armed, but there's a nuclear and conventional arms race in South Asia. And the upshot of that nuclear and conventional arms race is that many of these countries, but principally India and Pakistan, and I'll leave China out for the moment here, but India and Pakistan have massive defense budgets. Money is spent on defense, on building these arsenals, far more than it is ever spent on human security or human development. Let's talk about some priorities, okay? Right there. So when you've got three nuclear powers all competing with each other, that does create for a rather risky environment. We do hope that the principle or the concept of deterrence works, although India and Pakistan have now twice proved that wrong. Once in 1999, a year after they both tested nuclear weapons, and more recently in February of this year. Okay, so right there, things are getting a little messy. And let's not forget the great power competition, and I'm going to use that term, which seems a little archaic these days, but that great power competition that continues to rage in South Asia. Russia is back. Let me tell you that, right? We thought we'd heard the end of Russia after the end of the Cold War, the Soviet intervention, all of those things. No, they are back. They're back in Afghanistan. They remain the largest weapons supplier for India. And they have made all sorts of overtures towards Pakistan and other countries in the region. One of the most recent rounds of negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban before the Americans came back to the table for the umpteenth time took place in Moscow. Who would have imagined in 1989, 1990, or even 10 years ago that Russia would be back there, right there, okay? And Russia, like other parts of the world, is taking full advantage, Russia and China, of the American withdrawal from South Asia as it is withdrawing from other regions as well. The last piece of sort of the geopolitical sort of piece that I want to just point out to you is also the competition between China and India that is taking place in South Asia, sort of the two big emerging powers or major powers. Both have aspirations to be major powers. I don't think India is meeting its goal as well as it would like for a variety of different reasons, but they too are competing with each other, and they're competing in two ways. One, they're competing in traditional ways. Both are building up their arsenals, and they're building up their navies for competition in the Indian Ocean region. The other way in which they are competing is by trying to buy influence among the smallest states in South Asia, right? Money, goods, all sorts of other things, okay? So you've got sort of the big picture over here, the geopolitical picture. Think about it. Nuclear powers, disputed borders, unfinished business of nation and state building, right there, the big picture. Now, let's turn our attention for a few minutes to what I think are the even more pressing challenges that are internal in nature, but are nonetheless, I think, very serious, and in some ways, I think perhaps more urgent than some of these big security or traditional security problems. The first thing I think that's quite obvious, and I think when Sid first asked me to give a talk here, she wanted me to talk about ethnic and nationalist conflicts in the region. So one of the sort of, I think, the most striking things about internal challenges is the broad range of political violence, and I'm going to use that term, political violence, to frame different kinds of conflicts. And those conflicts, we hear about them as ethnic conflicts, sectarian conflicts, conflicts over resources, conflicts over political power, all of those things. Some of the most prominent ones, and I'll just mention some of them for you over here. One of the big ones was in the 1970s that among the Bengalis in what was then West Pakistan, and culminated in the breakup of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. Since then, there have been a number of different insurgencies, and they have a sort of a far longer history. Ongoing insurgency in Kashmir, the insurgency among the Sikhs in India, which in the 1980s, number of different insurgencies in Pakistan, most prominently today among the Baloch, that's the southwest of Pakistan, if you will. The Tamils in Sri Lanka, 30-plus year civil war that came to an end only recently. Conflicts in Assam, in the northeast of India, Nagaland, the Naxalites, the list goes on. Okay? We also hear about religious conflicts in South Asia. We've heard about them historically, conflicts between Hindus and Muslims, but also all sorts of other conflicts, and in fact, even conflicts between and among Muslims in the region, and Pakistan and Bangladesh are good examples of that. These conflicts, I think, stem from a number of different, sources. But I think the big argument that I would make over here is that most of them can be attributed to conflicts over resources and political power. And that's a shorthand way of talking about them. And the reason why I want to really emphasize the political and the economic and structural roots of these different conflicts that run across the region is that very often we, fall into very simplistic depictions as these are ethnic, these are religious, okay? And while ethnic and religious identities might be very important ways of mobilizing people, at the heart of them, these are not very rarely about ethnic identity or religious identity. And I think it's important to keep those things in mind. I think it's also important to keep those things in mind because very often when groups have particular kinds of grievances, most of the time they're looking for political power or greater autonomy within existing states. But the way in which governments deal with them, particularly through military means, tend to exacerbate those conflicts and lead to further separatist movements and violence. I think these conflicts are important for another reason, too. They have led to proxy wars in South Asia. What do I mean by proxy wars in South Asia? A couple of examples, okay? The Indians who supported the Bengali insurgents in 1971. Pakistan, which at different points in time has supported insurgents in Kashmir, okay? Indians, in turn, have been accused of supporting insurgents in Balochistan in Pakistan, and most famously, Pakistan's support for different insurgent groups in Afghanistan during the 1980s, and again, more recently, since 9/11, okay? So these kinds of conflicts have the tendency to spill over. They have the tendency of engaging countries in proxy wars, and they have the tendency of creating blowback. In other words, proxy wars never work, and South Asian experience shows that, and I'll be happy to say more about that later on. These conflicts have led to massive refugee movements and forced migration. Much of the migration that takes place in South Asia, but also other parts of the world, is internal. In other words, internally displaced persons. But we also have refugees that pour over state boundaries. The breakup, or I would say the partition of South Asia and the Indian subcontinent in 1947 itself led to 3 million displaced people and 1 million dead. That's a number we don't talk about very often. We've had massive refugee movements since then. 3 million refugees, or close to 3 million refugees were in Pakistan as a consequence of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. 1 million of those still remain. Nearly 1 million Afghan refugees remain in Iran. And the most significant refugee crisis recently has been the crisis of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, who are principally based in Bangladesh. I think it's important to think a little bit about this too, because these refugees are coming into countries that are incapable of taking care of them. Bangladesh is a great example, as is Pakistan, but to a lesser extent, okay? These are already vulnerable populations. We bring in large numbers of refugees who have no place to go. Think about what impact that has on local societies and the domestic politics of these countries. In addition, let me just sort of, give some of the other issues that I think are internal security challenges. In addition to this, I think some of the things that we're all sort of familiar with are issues like food scarcity. It's really about the availability of food, but it's much more about the distribution of food, okay? It's also more complicated with climate change, environmental issues, and the fact that South Asia has a burgeoning population and what we refer to often as the youth bulge. In other words, South Asia has one of the youngest populations in the world. That's a good thing, but that also has its own set of challenges. South Asia also, like other regions of the world, is increasingly urbanized. That itself then puts pressure on space, but also resources like food, food distribution, etc. I think the big sort of issue that's in South Asia, and has been a big security challenge for a long time, but we're only now paying attention to it, is the issue of water. Water scarcity, right there, okay? And water resources are depleting, and they're depleting very quickly. There is population pressure, urbanization, all of those things. But it's also the way in which policy has been made around water issues, both within states and between states, that has worsened water shortages. Okay? When you think about sort of riots, I grew up in Karachi, a city of 22 million. And among all of the other issues and problems, we would often have riots over water. No water, and people would be fighting over water and the privatization of water resources that we are seeing in South Asia, but also in many other parts of the world. The other complicated factor when we start talking about water resources are the conflicts over river waters between the riparian countries of South Asia. In other words, India and Pakistan fighting over river waters, India and Bangladesh, India and China. One of Pakistan's worst fears is that India will turn off the tap one day. What happens? India, conversely, fears that China will do the same to it. Today, when we talk about flashpoints of conflict or potential conflicts in South Asia, you look at all of these scenarios put out by the CIA and State Department and all of them, water ranks pretty high up there in terms of conflicts, not only within states, but between states. Following from that, if you want to talk about resource scarcity, energy is clearly a big one, again, for many of the same reasons that we see in terms of other resource depletion, growing population, industrialization, okay? All of those things that are putting a lot of pressure on energy and energy resources. And none of the countries in South Asia have really done a very good job of managing that. I think India is trying to do so, and so is Pakistan, but it's a mixed picture. There are also discussions in South Asia, as they are in this country today, about nuclear power and the use of nuclear power to provide for the energy needs of South Asian states. We also see a competition for energy sources between India and China taking place in other parts of the world as well. Okay? The other sort of couple of big things, the last one that I'm going to sort of bring up, and I think it's absolutely a central problem for all of us, wherever we are, is climate change and environmental pollution. Okay? The impact of climate change and the connection between climate change and national security is tenuous at times, but it's nonetheless incredibly important. Okay? And we have seen this in South Asia. We've seen this all over the world. Catastrophic climate events. The incapacity of states and governments to address them. The lack of preparation. Okay? And we see that I think countries in South Asia at this point in time are perhaps making more of an effort to deal with problems pertaining to climate change than we see in this country. Okay? But that's a big one. And how these countries deal with issues of climate change, environmental pollution, that's going to be one of the biggest problems that they're all going to be contending with. So let me just sort of conclude by saying a couple of other things over here. This list of sort of non-traditional problems or non-traditional security challenges begs for cooperation, regional solutions. Yet, that's the piece we continue to struggle with, okay? And that's the piece we continue to struggle with because of the conflicts in the region itself, okay? And I think the India-Pakistan conflict, the conflict over Kashmir, which really escalated earlier this year, and India's decision to abrogate Article 370 and the political economy of Kashmir in August, has made the situation much worse. I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But when we think about sort of the human rights violations that are taking place in Kashmir today, and not that they're not taking place in other parts of South Asia, I could give you a long list of them, but the human rights violations are simply horrific. And yet we hear very little about it, okay? And I think that's really a big piece of it. The other developments, and I think these are sort of worth keeping in mind as well, and these are trends that are not, again, limited to South Asia, but there's the South Asian versions of them. And that is, I think, the growing rise of extreme nationalist movements and extremist ideologies. We have seen that most recently in the case of India and Hindu nationalism. India, the world's largest democracy. And by the way, today, all countries in South Asia are nominally democratic. What that means, I'm not always entirely sure, but they are. They do have regular elections, among other things. And that's a huge step for countries in South Asia, particularly a place like Pakistan, which for most of its history has been ruled by military regimes. It has a civilian government in place now, right? But I think it's really important for us to think about some of these, I think, the human rights violations, the enduring conflicts in South Asia, even as we celebrate all of its wonderful developments, and that I will say I think are great in the sense of burgeoning middle class, okay? Technological developments, market, trade outside of the region. Some of the world's largest multinational corporations today are not American. I know we read all of them, and they are certainly very large and prominent. They're Indian. You look at the numbers, largest multinational corporations. Yet, some of the highest rates of poverty and inequality in the world existing side by side, right there. I think the last thing, and I know that I'm getting my signal over here to go into Q&A, but I think the last thing, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the question and answer period, I think what's also complicated things in the region is the United States' foreign policy. And I would make the argument that the complication has not just arisen because of the Trump administration. There's a much longer history of that. But I think at this point in time, I think it has added to the anxiety in the region, particularly for countries like Pakistan, in terms of what happens. The United States continues to maintain, I think, nearly 14,000 troops in Afghanistan, but nonetheless keeps making noises about getting out. When that will happen, I'm not entirely sure of that. But so I think the big sort of takeaway would be that while we've talked about all of these issues in South Asia is a microcosm of the world. And many of these issues that these countries are grappling with, which are quite severe and are made more severe by the fact that you have 3 nuclear powers, are issues that we are all grappling with in one way or another. And I think the hope that many, civil society organizations and progressive activists have in South Asia, that we can all perhaps work together on finding solutions for our common problems, regardless of where we are. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions for the remaining time. Sorry, I've gone over a little bit. Yes, please.
Just after just something in the region.
Yes.
Just 5 years ago, half of the Indian population, about 600 million, didn't have access to a toilet.
Right.
Okay, open defecation was common. When Prime Minister Modi came in, he promised that his campaign, it was for me so bizarre to hear, that one of his campaign promises was one toilet for every Indian. And as of October of 2019, he had built 110 million toilets, new toilets, in 5 years.
Right.
Which is by itself is amazing. What about obviously that problem is not solved just because there's a toilet. Now, we have to make people use the toilet instead of going to the woods. But what about Pakistan? What about Afghanistan? Other people in the region, even China, I understand in the country, they do have a similar problem.
I think the first thing I will
What's
say.
the sanitation?
Sanitation and health issues. I think those are huge.
It is, yes.
Absolutely. I think just to look at sort of headlines in the last week, I think even the New York Times and Washington Post had headlines about the HIV infection in Pakistan. So, over 1,000 cases, mostly among children, because of unsanitary conditions and the fact that doctors were using the same syringes among, dozens of children right there. So I think, health and sanitation issues are huge. They're huge across the region. And I think that's, again, these are issues about sort of human security and human development where the governments have not put sufficient resources. And even when they have tried, they have not been able to meet their targets. Of course, all of them do. All of them do. India, Pakistan, all of them do. I think the other part of this is, too, that you don't, you have some national health care, but again, that is, very limited. And most people don't have access to good health care, even particularly in the urban areas, not just the villages. We're not just talking about rural areas. We're talking about urban areas. We're talking about large cities. So this, I think anyone who thinks about sort of human security, human development, will say to you that that is a huge problem. Basic infectious disease, okay? Even things like polio, which have been an issue in places like Pakistan, but even things like malaria, TB, all of those things, which could be addressed fairly easily and relatively inexpensively, but yet resources are allocated for other things instead of that. And these are problems that run across the region. They're rife across the region. And people promise all sorts of things in their election campaigns and rarely deliver. At least they're doing, yes, the numbers are growing, yes. Let me, please, I'm just going to try to take the questions in the order that I saw your hands go up.
The Kashmir crisis has been going on since I was born, I think. Is there a solution? What would it be?
Well, I think, there are solutions to it, but I'm not sure how willing the countries in the region, specifically India and Pakistan, will be to work on those solutions. So let me just say a couple of things here. Kashmir is a disputed territory between India and Pakistan, but the insurgencies, and I'm using a plural over here, the insurgencies that have been going on in Kashmir since 1987 are entirely local in origin. They stem from decisions made by various Indian governments. India tends to blame Pakistan for those insurgencies, and there's absolutely no doubt that Pakistan at different times has supported different insurgent groups, but Pakistan has also discovered that it doesn't have very much power with them ultimately. And its involvement and interference is negligible, if any, at this point in time. I think the abrogation of Article 370 and the imposition of federal and central rule over Kashmir was a bad decision. And I think it has compounded a situation that was bad and made it much, much worse. And I think the solution for this is a very long-term one that has to be addressed by the Indian government. And the first thing would be to talk about the human rights abuses and violations, the free hand that the Indian military has, and whatever solutions one can come up with are going to have to be long-term solutions that involve the people of Kashmir. The people of Kashmir on both sides of the border, okay? The Pakistan part of Kashmir is not a heaven by any stretch of the imagination either. I think from my perspective, what has been really unfortunate is the fact that the Kashmiri people themselves have been rarely consulted in terms of what happens on both sides. But the other part is that at different points in time, India and Pakistan have come to a tacit agreement about the line of what they refer to as the line of control, the border, and saying this is what it is today. Let's take it as it is, and we will continue to cooperate in other areas. And at one point in time, about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, we were actually seeing some trade across that border. And those were all good things. But for a variety of reasons, there's been a reversal in that. And I think the Modi government and the BJP has made a bad situation much, much worse. So my short answer to your question is, I don't see any resolution in the short term. But in the long term, I think the governments in the region, India and Pakistan, and specifically India, is going to have to rethink its policies. Imposing military control, and it has been under police and military control for many years now, is not the solution. I don't see it as the way out. Yes.
I didn't hear the word corruption.
Good question.
Did I miss it?
No, you didn't miss it. And thank you for reminding me about that. Endemic corruption. I think corruption, the lack of accountability, and transparency. Okay, I think these are things, again, that I think run through all of the countries in South Asia. I think these are things that have, I think, created not only political problems, but also problems in the economy, including sort of foreign investment in places like India, Pakistan, elsewhere. And corruption is a huge issue. I think some of the, sort of the conflicts and tensions that I alluded to in terms of the grievances of different groups, I think stem in large part out of these, I think, battles against corruption and the lack of any kind of redistributive justice. And corruption is very much a part of that. And I think every single government, sort of in South Asia that comes in says it's going to, clean the house, so to speak, clean this. We have our own version of clean the swamp right there. And with some success, but not much. And I think when you're also dealing, and I'm not making excuses, because I think corruption is at the most elite levels, but it also goes right down to the bottom. And I think when you have such glaring inequality and poverty, some of that is also inevitable. When you don't have a rule of law that actually works, some of that becomes inevitable. But I think the corruption that's at the highest levels of government and industry, I think that's a huge problem. And I think that really prevents, I think, countries from economic development in many respects as well. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm curious. You mentioned that you felt that India was ahead of us in terms of climate change initiatives. Could you give us some specific examples?
I think in terms of, I wouldn't say necessarily initiatives themselves, but in terms of the intentions, and particularly at this point in time. I think India and China in particular, actually, I will say, is investing much more in green energy resources, is trying very, very hard with not much success, India and to a lesser extent China now, controlling pollution, okay? And I think the fact of the matter is, and this is, I think, one of the things that I think makes me a little bit more optimistic here, is that there's a recognition of these being problems. And right there, the fact that there is recognition. I mean, I think if you look at, I think I just read the statistic, I think yesterday or the day before, out of the 20 most polluted cities in Asia, 15 of them are in India, right there. And Pakistan is not far behind, cities like Karachi and Lahore, etc. So I think there is at least a very clear recognition of what the problems are. There is a recognition of the science of those problems amongst, I think, most people, not just government officials and most people. And I think there is really efforts to invest more in things like green energy sources, alternative energy sources, putting more money into those as well, okay? The flip side of it too, I think, and this is where it becomes a little bit problematic, is there also efforts to use hydropower, okay? And when you start talking about hydropower, then that opens all sorts of other problems as well, including sort of displacement of people, impact on the environment. So these are tough issues. But the fact that there is recognition, the fact that there are a number of NGOs, civil society organizations, all of them sort of actively working together, in some cases working with governments of the region to address these problems. And India is a signatory to the climate treaty, unlike the United States that's withdrawn. I think that is at least something. And I think this is a more recent development. And I think the urgency has really hit home. Whether or not these countries can do something and what they can do, given I think the nature of the problem and how huge it is, that's a different question. Yes, please.
You mentioned the lack of regional integration
Right.
in the region. How successful has the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC, in trying to bring the member countries of South Asia together to address some of their economic and political issues?
I think that's a great question. Thank you. The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation was set up in 1985. And it was set up at the initiative of the smaller countries in South Asia, specifically Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, interestingly enough, right there. And while SARC, I think, has been successful to some extent in coming up with, I think, usually they're sort of common statements of policy. They're not even treaties. Sometimes they're agreements, formal agreements, on issues such as human trafficking, smuggling, drug trafficking, issues that are certainly very important, but don't always rise to the level of those traditional security issues. SARC, I think, has been most successful in providing a forum for different countries to come together, and specifically providing a forum, again, for the smallest states in the region itself. The reason why SARC and its, I think, success has been stymied is principally because of India and Pakistan, and mostly because of India, which insists that any kind of significant issue, including refugees, disputed boundaries, etc., should be addressed in bilateral ways, i.e. India and Pakistan, India and Nepal, India and Sri Lanka. So that has really stymied SARC. I think the other thing we see is that they have these they have big annual meetings. And very often they won't have an annual meeting. Why? Because India and Pakistan are at loggerheads over something or the other. So even those annual meetings are canceled at the last minute. So I think because of this bilateral conflict and dispute, I think it hasn't succeeded as much as it might have. But on the other hand, it is there, it has done some good work, and it continues to provide a forum and an institutional framework should the countries in the region really decide to take advantage of it, and it would be in their interest to do so. Yes? Depends on who you're talking to. No, and not the Pakistanis, okay? The Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's big initiative to basically integrate regions, not just Asia. It's, part of it is in Italy and all over the place they're going. So it's a huge project and a very ambitious project. Pakistan was one of the early signatories, given China and Pakistan are very close friends and allies, was one of the initial early signatories and the CPEC, what we refer to, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So very much. And China has also signed on Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, other countries as well. The big holdout is India. Okay? And China has invited India to join the initiative, but India has refused. And I think perhaps from an Indian government's perspective, they think it's the right thing to do, because they see this as a way of China asserting its influence in the region. They see it as asserting its influence at the expense of India. And they see it as a way for China encroaching onto India's sphere of influence, if I can put it in those terms. So from the Indian perspective, yes, it is a huge security issue. And I think the other thing to also note is that while Pakistan continues to see India as the principal security threat to, or an existential threat, as some would say, India doesn't see Pakistan as the main security threat, which I think tends to upset some Pakistanis, but sees China as the principal security threat. So given that, yes, absolutely. I mean, these are, I think, sort of the strategic and geopolitical issues that are very much, I think, at the heart of some of the things that I've been talking about over here. Yes, please.
All the problems in the region is can be attributed to burgeoning population. 30, 40, 50 years ago, we were hearing a lot about Chinese population control, and also in India, family planning, etc. But we don't hear of those things nowadays at all. Was there any success from the previous policies? Is it still getting some attention in that field?
I think the success is mixed, and as you pointed out, I think the burgeoning population is one of the biggest issues, and that's what puts pressure on resources, water, energy, all of those things. The Indian, I think, population planning policies in the 1960s and 70s, I think, was successful to some extent, but they were also highly draconian. In many ways, like similar, not quite as, I think, bad as the Chinese policies, but they were. And I think that also, in many ways, I think, created problems further along. And I think population planning policies, and population is a huge issue for all of these countries. And they're all trying in one way or another to address this. I think along with population, I will say the other big issue is not just about space, it's also about density of population, and density of population in urban areas. And it's the urbanization also that has created its own set of pressures and conflicts and violence. So I think my response to your question here would be yes, it's a huge problem. I think countries are trying to address it in different ways. But again, I don't think they're consistent policies. And these are the kinds of things where you could really have regional cooperation and collaboration. That's a great example of that. And we don't see that really happening as such. So, anything else? Thanks so much. Thank you. Oh, wow. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here on a Monday afternoon. You've been great fun, and thanks for all your great questions.
And we have for you a candle from Prosperity Candle.
Oh,
which
thank you.
empowers female entrepreneurs all over the world and employs refugees in East Hampton.
Perfect. Thank you so
thank you
much.
all.